There's been a conversation going on for a while now on the League of Reason and its epistemological foundations. I know that Jericom Movie has made a video a while ago, as has Veritas48 and others, and this has sparked quite a bit of dialogue and discussion as to what constitutes knowledge and the popularization of other such ideals that are supported by those of the League of Reason. It would seem to me that so far as the critiques of the League of Reason have focused on either their foundations of knowledge or their self-absorption. In my view, there is still another problem with their epistemological foundation, and that is their endorsement of philosophical postmodernism, but more on that in a moment. Obviously, I'd like to throw in my 2 cents, whatever that's worth, into this discussion. I like to do this simply because I view the League of Reason as a very good paradigm case for a lot of the sort of popularization one finds in thought today in media as well as in free thinker circles, when one approaches the idea of knowledge, that is. Specifically, I like to focus my attention on 2 rather irritating and tiresome ideals that are commonplace in many circles, 2 ideals that the League of Reason's epistemology depicts rather perfectly, those being 1, their endorsement of Scientism, and 2, their endorsement of philosophical postmodernism and several of its tenets. I'll take each of these in turn. Consider the endorsement of Scientism first. If you have ever been a subscriber to me for a long time or for a while, you will realize that I've addressed this topic on a number of occasions. For example, in my video, Seeing is Believing, the Argument from Science, a Response, and the Presupposition and Limits of Science, I deal with several difficulties scientism faces. Let me outline several of these for you here in brief. First, and perhaps most importantly, if you think about the very nature of science, it rules out the possibility of attaining all knowledge through this method. Perhaps the most fundamental distinction we can make is the difference between first and second order disciplines. Where science is a first order discipline and can study many things, it cannot study itself. Philosophy, however, is a second order discipline, meaning that philosophy studies philosophical issues, like the principle of being and knowledge, but philosophy can also study other disciplines as well. Since philosophy operates as a self-referential discipline by asking presuppositional questions about itself and other disciplines, philosophy is more versatile and constructive than other disciplines. Therefore, since science is not a second-order discipline, it cannot answer certain questions without crossing over into philosophy, and therefore science is limited in its explanatory scope. So I would argue, while science is very helpful in our search for truth, philosophy, at the end of the day, is going to help us find truth in a broader sense, as this is philosophy's function. Second, scientism as a theory of knowledge has several internal failings. As been pointed out by others already in this discussion, it would seem that the strong forms of scientism are self-refuting, for strong scientism is not itself a proposition of science, but of philosophy, and thus would have to be rejected on its own tenets. Second, scientism does not allow for the necessary propositions that science requires to function. In other words, science requires a number of facts in order to function. For example, mathematical truth, logical inference, trustworthiness of our sense experience, the order of the external world, adequate language to refer to the external world, etc. We could go on. And since none of these can be proven via science, they would need to be rejected. However, if they are rejected, then science itself cannot function, and around we would have to go. Third, scientism cannot account for the rationality and justified beliefs that all of us hold outside of science. For example, ethical truth, it is wrong to torture babies. Aesthetic truths, X is beautiful. And metaphysical truths, there are minds other than my own, or the external world was not created 5 minutes ago. These are all modes of rational justified belief outside the field of science. I would wager that those of the League of Reason would believe such truths. But in addition to these arguments, perhaps the most frustrating part of the League of Reason's endorsement of scientism is their inconsistent endorsement of it when it comes to theological cynicism and the God discussion. As I pointed out before, in order for there to be an argument against God from science, 2 facts need to obtain. 1, it needs to be agreed that both science and theological statements make propositional statements that claim to be true, and 2, science and theology do not operate in differing domains or levels. In other words, in order for there to be a conflict between science and theology, they must interact via some model that does not treat them as polar opposites. It is here, at this second fact, that we can see an inconsistency in their arguments often. Scientism does not allow for theology to operate as a system of thought and knowledge, so obviously if this is held, you can't argue that science disproves God. It is simply inconsistent in their position. Moreover, it seems almost impossible to outright disprove God through science. The League of Reason may argue that science disproves God, but this is no more than an assertion. It is certainly possible that science could disprove certain theological claims, but one should not equate this possibility with outright disproof of God. But I'll digress. The second aspect of the League of Reason's epistemology is their appealing implicit acceptance of certain tenets of philosophical postmodernism. As a philosophical position, postmodernism can be characterized simply as a reinterpretation of what knowledge is and what counts as knowledge. Simple enough, right? However, along with this, we get certain tenets such as relativization of certain key areas of thought, such as meaning and happiness, ethics, linguistic meaning, historical interpretation, and most baffling on occasion, truth. But if you get right down to it, I don't see how the physical postmodernists can hold to this position and not suffer from the weight of their own self-contradiction. Postmodernists appear to claim that their own assertions about the modern era, about how language and consciousness work and so forth, are true and rational, and they write literary texts and protest when people misinterpret their authorial intent in their own writings. In these and other ways, postmodernists seem to be self-refuting, for if lingual meaning is relative, if ethics are relative, etc., then if they wish to be consistent, they should not protest. Truly, either a system or an element of a system of truth-seeking, relativism denies all manner of absolutes. I find this frustrating for several reasons, one mentioned above already, but let me take, for the sake of brevity, two quick examples: ethics and meaning and happiness. Consider the idea of moral values as relative. There's a whole slew of objections against this position that I could raise and would raise if this was the central idea of this discussion, but one stands out rather poignantly. If moral values are indeed relative, then there is no such thing as moral progress or moral reformation. If what is morally good is merely what one's culture says is morally good, then we can only say that cultural norms change, not that the society is progressing or getting better. Moreover, moral reformers by definition change a society's code by arguing that it is somehow morally inadequate. But if cultural relativism is true, an act is right if and only if it is society's code. So the reformer is, by definition, immoral, since he adapts a set of values outside the society's code and attempts to change that code in keeping with these values. Now, any moral view which implies this is simply false, and it's obviously that way. If you want to say Martin Luther King is immoral for offering rights for African Americans, it would seem obvious that you're wrong. Or consider philosophical postmodernists' view on happiness and meaning. With the relativization of truth, postmodernists have contributed to the absolutation of desire satisfaction. With truth dethroned as an important guide for life, something had to take its place, and the heir to the throne is the absolute importance of satisfying one's desires, end quote. That's J.P. Moreland. Now, I'm not going to argue that the League of Reason's position is that truth is relative, for if that indeed was their position, then I don't see the point in arguing for anything in the first place. But what I am arguing is that their implicit appreciation of certain tenets of philosophical postmodernism, specifically relativism and the denial of absolutes, seems to suggest that if there is indeed no absolutes, then their appreciation of truth as an absolute is a double standard and one that needs explanation, as well as why there are no other absolutes other than the absolute nature of truth. In any case, postmodernism as a philosophical system and one that purports to be truth-seeking cannot establish any real idea of happiness. This is evident in the prevalent appreciation of contemporary happiness and its hallmarks of pleasurable satisfaction, intense emotive feelings, and whatever feels good at the time is alright as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else and makes you happy. But this is not happiness, obviously. The abandonment of the classical notion of happiness for its trivial, superficial contemporary counterpart has given rise to what psychologists call the empty self. I don't have time to go into this here, but suffice it to say that I think one could argue rather persuasively that the classical notion of happiness is much more akin to bring about happiness. Regardless, these are some of the reasons why I find the notion of scientism and philosophical postmodernism as simply tired and ill-effective in persuading or finding truth. If the League of Reason wishes to slap these onto a banner and fly them high, then I think it's only a matter of time before these banners cannot sustain the endeavors that the League of Reason wishes them to sustain.